Yeah, again, thank you for joining us online. I'm very glad that, we're getting to have this chat with people who weren't able to make it in person as well. And yeah, thankfully, yeah, we can record so it can reach some more people. I was saying that this is not the first time this month, even, or in the past month, that our event plans have been scuppered by storms. So thank you very much for being so accommodating, everyone. So my name is Christina Riley. I run a project called the Nature Library, which is a library and a reading space which celebrates books that highlight the natural world in all its forms, at a time when it needs our attention the most. So it started as a pop-up library in 2019 and kind of travelled around public spaces in Scotland, from cafes to ferry terminals and galleries, museums, kind of anywhere that I could possibly take it. And it now has a permanent space in Irvine at the harbour side, which is where we were hoping to be today. And it's open for public borrowing as well now. So if you are local, or if you'd like to make the trip, the next open day will be Sunday the 15th of December, from 10 till 4. And it's also open by appointment, so you can just kind of get in touch with the library if you want to come along. And I'm joined today for this launch for Remember the Rowan by Kirsten MacQuarrie, who is a Scottish writer, artist, and librarian, and whose writing has been published by New Writing Scotland, the Scottish Poetry Library, Gutter Magazine, Scottish Pen, Glasgow Women's Library, the Federation of Writers Scotland, and Edinburgh Literary Salon. And her debut novel, Remember the Rowan, has been longlisted for the People's Book Prize, which is what we'll be chatting about today. And Kirsten will be in conversation with Gerry Cambridge, who is an Ayrshire poet with 6 poetry collections, and his first book of prose, The Ayrshire Nestling, was published this year. And in 1995, he founded The Dark Horse, which is Scotland's leading poetry journal and will mark its 50th issue in 2025. Congratulations. So I'm not going to talk much more because I'm very excited myself to hear you two in conversation. I came across, I wouldn't even say came across, I was informed of Kathleen Raine thanks to Kirsten. So we did an event earlier in the year about Kathleen Raine's kind of collaboration with the artist Barbara Hepworth, and we just got to talk about their connections to the natural world and the way that they work and the way that they think. And I feel like just from the little fragments that I've learned of Kathleen Raine's work through your encyclopedic knowledge and passion for her has just kind of been building throughout the year. And then when I saw here, this book, just thought, I feel like this just will culminate, it just culminates everything that you've learned about her and the story that you want to tell about her. So I just can't wait to hear you two in conversation. So Kirsten and Gerry are going to chat about the book. And if you have any questions throughout the talk, then just put them in the chat box and we can kind of go through those at the end. But yeah, I'll pass over to Gerry. You can continue. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Christina. This very meaty novel.
We call it value for money, or if you get it from your library, it's free. Yeah.
Charts the somewhat harrowing at times relationship between Gavin Maxwell and Kathleen Raine. It's beautifully written. It's got some astonishingly emotional set pieces in it, which are among some of the most powerful bits of writing I've read recently. It's sort of underpinned by great scholarship as well. So I guess my first opening gambit and question for Kirsten is, when did you first come across the name Kathleen Raine?
That is a good question. Thank you.
In what context?
Yes, well, and I know, Gerry, you're an exception to this rule, because what I often find myself saying is that too many Scots encounter Kathleen Raine through Gavin Maxwell as a kind of footnote to his life. And I know that wasn't the case for you coming from poetry, but for the rest of us out in the wider world, it is such a frustration to me that actually we don't encounter her nearly enough. And the first time I heard the name Kathleen Raine, it was actually in the audiobook version of Ring of Bright Water. And what's striking about that is this was at the time when I was painting, and of course I saw the otter on the cover, and I thought, oh, this, as an animal lover, this is the book for me. And funnily enough, I actually switched it off quite soon because Gavin Maxwell struck me as a bit pompous, a bit arrogant. I thought, I'm not sure I like this chap, but something pulled me back, and that's a real sliding doors moment, because without that, 4 years later, here we are. But Kathleen Raine is mentioned obliquely a couple of times in Ring of Bright Water, Gavin Maxwell's by far his best known book, which takes its title, I later discovered, from one of Kathleen Raine's poems. It's not quite clear what their connection is, what her relationship to him has been, is at the point of writing. And what I then discovered was that the poem that, as I've mentioned, gives Ring of Bright Water its title and opens the book in its entirety was written by Kathleen Raine, but in those editions, in the classic editions, her name does not appear in the page. It's buried amidst the acknowledgements, and the collection it comes from is mistitled. And in the audiobook version in particular, it sounds as if Gavin Maxwell wrote the darn poem himself. So she's there in this kind of Maxwellian universe in quite a sort of enigmatic way. And those who do encounter Kathleen Raine through that prism, you tend to hear one of two things: either that she had an unrequited love for Gavin Maxwell, or that she, quote unquote, cursed him. Now, I think it's needless to say, especially as Scotland reckons with our history of witchcraft accusations, persecutions, prosecutions, not before time, how reductive and how misogynistic that narrative is. So the more I encountered her, especially when I read her work myself, I was blown away by the power of her vision and astonished that I hadn't encountered her before. So I wanted to play my part in writing the novel in doing her legacy in Scotland justice. If one fewer person reads this book and knows as a result that does not think of Kathleen Raine as the witch that cursed Gavin Maxwell, and instead thinks of her as one of our greatest, most underrated poetic minds, then it will have done its job.
Right, okay. And did you quickly realise that she'd been neglected? This is as you say, this is a real problem with some of Gavin Maxwell's attributions, because I remember that, I think it's at the end of one of his books, The Loch's the Main, there's a beautiful poem which finishes, "And let my lover bird of passage pass." I remember reading that and thinking, that's Gavin Maxwell. But now that I know that his habit of not attributing authorship to the people he was quoting from, I'm not at all sure whether that is or not. It could be someone else. I can't find who wrote it if I Google it. But did your research then begin on the internet, or at what point did it move from say looking at matters on the internet to her individual books? Because I know you've practically got Kathleen's entire published corpus, really, including letters and all sorts of things. I kind of came to her really as a poet first, rather than through the Gavin Maxwell connection, because I was aware of her. So did you find, whenever you were beginning to research that you did find that she was neglected? Because a lot of people who are au fait with the poetry scene might say that she's not necessarily neglected in the poetry culture, at least. She's quite known. I mean, Faber recently published a big, thick collected poems with a very striking yellow cover and so on. So, I mean, what was your initial impressions when you were researching from her appearance in Gavin Maxwell's books?
Yeah, it's. I think that point about Maxwell's attribution habits is an interesting one, and as you say, it carried on to a greater or lesser extent across his body of work. Lords of the Atlas, one of his final pieces of travel writing in particular, and he does it in such a, as we see in Ring of Bright Water, such a charmingly stylish way. Like, I couldn't put it better than the scholars that went before me. So here, have at them. And then the first half of this book, which I'm sure made the deadline, seem that much more attainable when the first half was written years before. But I think in terms of my own research, because as you mentioned, I have built up my very much treasured Kathleen Raine collection, and I'm lucky enough now to have a first edition of all 11 of her poetry collections. And perhaps that tells us all, because you're right, Faber have republished in early 21st century after her death her collected poems. That is the only one that's in print. And I think it's right to think of it as a body of work rather than even exclusively poetry, because not only are there a lot of poems, she was famously self-punitive, she was famously rigorous. There's a lot of what I would say really excellent poems that never made her own personal cut, and that means that readers are not encountering them at all. But she was not exclusively a poet. She wrote 4 full volumes of autobiography, a wide, dazzling really range of academic publications specialising in William Blake, also Yeats, Coleridge, the great poets. And as I mentioned in my author's note, she would have been too modest to count herself amongst their number, but I certainly wouldn't have any reservations about counting her there. And I think it's a relative lack of acknowledgement. I mean, we could actually, you're the right person to speak to about poetry's lack of recognition in the wider world, but even within that, I think Kathleen Raine should be a name that Scots, as we learn to read, that it nurtures our reading culture, our poetic culture. And interestingly, when we're thinking about how I researched the novel, it really begins and ends with her words. So one of the first books that I acquired was her collected poems and her volumes of autobiography. So particularly volume 3, The Lion's Mouth, that was really my North Star, because she speaks incredibly candidly about her feelings for Gavin Maxwell. So that was what empowered me to think, firstly, to realise there's more to this story than people realise, because again, The Lion's Mouth is well out of print, and also to realise the angle that I could contribute, because, as I say, she very unassuming, self-blaming really about everything that went awry in their relationship. And much as Kathleen did not claim herself to be a feminist, I think, well, I can bring a feminist lens, and that can be my contribution to the story. I think what also struck me in the research process, because I've been lucky enough to visit a whole range of locations that were key to Kathleen's life, particularly Great Bavington, where she grew up during the First World War, and Ullswater, Martindale village, where she and her children took shelter during the Second World War. They are making efforts to acknowledge her, to memorialise her, to celebrate her. And yes, it's on a smaller scale than I would like. To give an example, I have had an application in with English Heritage for a blue plaque for Kathleen Raine in Paulton Square, where she lived in Chelsea. And they said she was almost shortlisted, but didn't quite make it because her current profile wasn't high enough. So it's not what I would like to see. And incidentally, what would raise her profile higher than a blue plaque? But that's the logic that we're locked into. But yeah, Great Bavington, Martindale, they are making efforts to acknowledge her, whereas in Scotland, that really seems, all the rarer. And I feel that is because her reputation up here in particular has been overshadowed by the Gavin Maxwell connection and the myth telling that has encircled that, and she has become a witch rather than a woman, let alone a poet.
Yes, yeah. You tell a very interesting wee story about one of the films that was made about her. Well, it wasn't made about her; it was made about Gavin Maxwell. Do you want to give us a little impression of that?
If I must, you do know I
portrayal.
I love to hate this film, and this impression. And I think it's quite telling, even the way that we have to phrase that about it's a film that it's not about her, and yet she appears as the villainess. So this, and it actually goes to show that this is not Gavin Maxwell's fault, if I can put it as starkly as that this film that we're talking about came out in 1979, I believe. So, I mean, a good decade after he has died, and yet it does not use Kathleen's name. So it's a documentary style retelling of Gavin Maxwell's life, but she is not given her name, to the point that the actress that plays her in the credits is not credited as playing Kathleen Raine. She's credited as playing the Rowan Tree Woman, and it's just an utter disgrace. I mean, she looks like she was 6 years older than Gavin Maxwell. She looks at least 25 years older in this film. She's hanging off his arm quite literally, and when we come to the curse, and we might discuss that a bit in greater detail soon, but she's, you know, that it's a dark and stormy night. She's got a shawl over her head. Of course, everything's in black. She goes up to the Rowan and, let Gavin suffer in this place as I am suffering. It's abhorrent. It's so misogynistic. It's just a disgrace. So that alone makes me feel the BBC owe us an adaptation of Remember the Rowan, because it's just, and even her poetry, the way that it's threaded through there, again, not acknowledged. It's yeah, it's heartbreaking to see, but fuel to the fire of why I think Remember the Rowan is necessary.
Yes. I mean, let's come to this whole idea of your treatment of both characters, because I have heard some people trying to make it a sort of a very divisive thing, this relationship that they had. Like, quite often, for example, if in Poetryland, if you end up talking about Ted Hughes and Sylvia Plath, people tend to have very, very demarcated views, one or the other. They're either a Hughesian or they're a Plathian. Very seldom do these two meet. And I wonder that there could be a danger of that happening here. But one of the really impressive things about your novel is that you're very even-handed in your treatment, even of Gavin Maxwell. And the novel also covers very interestingly the whole idea of someone writing about someone else, and what should be permitted in that. Because obviously, Maxwell was gay. He was gay at a time when it was illegal, and he could have been imprisoned. His reputation could have been in tatters. And there's a very powerful, I think it's one of the early episodes where there's a big blow up between them, where he discovers it in one of Kathleen's notebooks that she's been writing about him. So I wonder if you would like to talk a wee bit about that, as some of the tensions that are raised in that. But as I say, what the even-handedness in your account is one of the most impressive things about it, because it would be quite easy to actually, take Kathleen Raine's side, but obviously the actual relationship itself was very multi-layered, and it was really complicated, and there was very much they were both sort of almost locked into incompatibility, in a way. So what could you talk a wee bit about that early episode to do with the journals and so on?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's good to hear that from a reader's point of view, it does feel even-handed, because, of course, bringing that feminist lens to this relationship, feminism is ultimately about humanity, and that cannot be achieved if we reduce Maxwell's humanity in the process. And as you point out, he was facing intensely difficult social and legal circumstances. Their relationship begins in 1949. That's when they first meet. And by the early 50s, this is the heyday of persecution. This is when Alan Turing dies. This was no abstract threat for Maxwell, and I think he deserves compassion for that. And I do insist on calling him our anti-hero rather than our villain. If I object to Kathleen Raine being vilified, then I would do the same for Maxwell as well. Vilify perhaps the social conditions in which they both found themselves in. The chapter that you're mentioning, yes, this is a really interesting facet of the conflict between them. And as you say, perhaps an ultimate incompatibility, because I think Kathleen felt what could be a greater gift from one writer to another, but to write about her love for him, her feelings for him, her impressions of him. And yet for Gavin Maxwell, he feels that the greatest expression of love would be to keep this private. And he had very tangible reasons for wishing it so. And this continues throughout their relationship. At the scene that we're talking about, it takes place, actually, he is just on his way up to Sandaig, and Kathleen is getting a lift, as it were. Gavin was a notoriously wild driver, so it took them no time at all, but as per today, they hit inclement weather, they have to take shelter just on the border, and Kathleen heads out into the snow, and she's on Kielder Bridge, where it turns out they shared their childhoods kind of alone together, both inspired by this landscape but not knowing the other was there. And she stood on this bridge thinking, does she throw herself in or does she throw the book in? And she chooses the latter, and her words are lost. And this really did, obviously there's a degree of narrativization in any novel, but she really did throw her diaries, throw her journals into the water, and they were lost as a result. And it continues. Another aspect of attribution or lack thereof was the relationship from both sides with Gavin Maxwell's mother, Lady Mary Percy, who I think Kathleen very much interpreted, never thought she was quite up to scratch, that socially she was not up to. Gavin had at one point escorted Princess Margaret, so Kathleen, as a kind of lower middle class girl from Ilford, did not cut the mustard. And yet actually, perhaps it was more the threat of a woman coming so close, but she also had the edict that Gavin would not dedicate his work to Kathleen, or rather Kathleen would not dedicate it to him. So we have some cryptic, again, this is why it's so worth having the early collections to shine a light on, as well as the collected poems, because there are dedications to the not so subtle GM, and of course anybody that knew either writer I think would have sensed who GM was, but I think it caused Kathleen great pain that she couldn't express her love in the way that felt most natural to her. And of course, this is where when the curse is revealed, and it is Kathleen who reveals it to Gavin, however inadvertently, that again brings this into sharp focus. They're very conflicting views about how one writer expresses love to another.
She was obviously a very intense person in terms of her, one could say, sort of obsession with Gavin Maxwell and so on, and maybe a wee bit of evidence of her intensity in that regard is a previous, like Gavin Maxwell's precursor in a way. You can maybe tell us just a wee bit about in passing, and then we'll come back to other elements to do with his homosexuality and so on, but how that impinged upon Kathleen, because I know it's he's had enough of a light shone on him, so you want to it's more than Miss Raine. So
yes, the woman behind Ring of Bright Water, as I've been saying. But yes, I think we're talking about Alistair the aperitif, aren't we? So this is the when Kathleen's marriage to Charles Madge ends, she's then a single mother in the 1940s. No easy task, of course, then or now. And she has a relationship of sorts with a man called Alistair MacDonald, and her first collection, Stone and Flower, which Christina mentioned at the beginning, which features Barbara Hepworth's illustrations, that was dedicated to Alistair. And it's an intriguing relationship, certainly from what I've found in the National Library and in the archives. It had its dark side for Kathleen in particular. And I know this has always amused you, Gerry, that Alistair enlists once the Second World War breaks out, and it seems no coincidence that then extracts him from this relationship. So yes, I think from a man's point of view, it's interesting to see how the intensity of coming under enemy fire felt less than coming under Kathleen's wrath. But what really intrigues me about that relationship, and I mean, she would write that it could be months, even years before they saw one another. So it wasn't a conventional connection. And I think he was, above all else, a symbol to her. It was no coincidence, you'll hear in the name Alistair MacDonald, that he was a Scot. And Kathleen had long felt that Scotland was the root of her poetry, was the root of her inspiration. So I think she felt tremendous romantic potential wrapped up in this kind of quintessentially Scots figure. You know, I mean, literally he would toss the caber as a hobby. And I think she it was the romantic idea of him rather than the reality. And she kind of came to see that, I think, in her own experiences. Her friend Gay Taylor, who makes a few cameos in Remember the Rowan, said that she sometimes had to send her lovers away to really think about them, and I think Alistair was the epitome of that. So it was an almost ran, but really kind of, I think you're right to point it to laying the foundations for what she found with Gavin Maxwell, because she really, the reason that he meant so much to her was not solely him as a man, but as a symbol, coming from Scotland, coming from the cradle of her poetry, the cradle of her vision, and reuniting her with that. I know that we're going to be maybe addressing that in a Dark Horse issue to come, which is very exciting, because Scotland meant such a great deal to Kathleen Raine. She was half Scottish, I would say, when you trace her ancestry back, and her mum had technically been born on the English side of the border, but felt that the lyrical, poetic potential of Scotland was where I think their understanding of womanhood as well as poetry came from. So it's yeah, it was ripe for romance when a dashing Scotsman walked into her life both times.
Yeah, and she did call Gab Maxwell her man of light as well, didn't she? To address the sort of symbolic aspect of it, which would be quite a thing for the man to live up to, especially someone of Gavin Maxwell's um, preferences and so on,
Yes, yeah.
and personality. So did Kathleen was her writing, did she write a lot about Maxwell directly, or was he just some kind of male muse for her own work?
The male muse, we don't hear that very often. And I think his impression, I think, again, as in so many of the issues that the novel raises, they might have diverged on that, because there is a key scene quite late on when Gavin says that she's never loved him, and she's looking at him as if, how can you be mad? I've been devoted to you for 15 years at that point, and yet it hasn't been the love that he truly needed from her. He was fond of the Thomas Traherne quote, no one was ever loved too much, but many have been loved in the wrong way, and all for too short a time. And I think it's a kind of grand tragedy that her desire to have a kind of, perhaps I was almost going to call it a conventional love. Now, it's certainly not conventional love that they do share, but her desire to possess him in some way, to really have recognition of what they meant to one another, then precludes her from extending friendship, extending genuine compassion for the social circumstances and the oppression that he's facing. She did write very extensively about him, and again, you can kind of compare and contrast the two, because I've mentioned he includes her kind of obliquely in a couple of places, but The Lion's Mouth in particular is an astonishingly candid piece of writing. To this day, the raw, radical honesty of it, it's breathtaking, and it certainly was my inspiration, the force behind writing Remember the Rowan, and in her poetry as well. And this is really the case, I think, for numerous collections. So the Year One, which is 1952, and it wins the Arts Council Poetry Prize in 1953. Her then collected poems, which was, I believe, 1956, that she does dedicate to Gavin Maxwell, and I address that in the novel, because it's a quote from Paradise Lost, and I think at that point that the paradise she perceived as discovering or rediscovering through him had indeed felt lost. And her then later collection, The Hollow Hill, that's now is it 1964, I believe. So you can see already that this relationship is really having an impact on her writing, because there's this 12-year gap that's altogether much more dark, much more harrowing, actually, I would say. But again, he appears in numerous poems, you know, to a greater or lesser extent. And even after Gavin Maxwell's death, on a deserted shore, it's an epic poetic sequence of life, love, loss that is published in the early 70s. And the soul's home is where we love, not where we live, is how she begins it. And I know that in the first editions, there was a frontispiece of one of Gavin Maxwell's paintings. So he really was, at the heart of her creative understanding of herself, understanding of Scotland, understanding of her life for throughout those decades, and actually beyond even the earthly relationship itself. What's interesting as well is that he does appear in later collections as well, and I sense a real shift in her work. If I was ever to write about Kathleen again, and I hope I do get the chance to do that, her time in India fascinates me, and it almost feels a sort of spiritual bookend to this era, to the Rowan era. She visited India first at the age of 74 and then went again. And I feel after that we can sense a bit of a shift, that what she thought she could only experience through Gavin Maxwell, this spiritually centred, spiritually grounded life, in fact, then she encounters a society where that is far better understood. And there are a couple of poems where she then mentions them slightly differently, that she says she will not open again the Book of Lives until it is time to close it overall. And another that mentions Psyche. So Psyche was a very resonant symbol for them both. It's the marriage of Psyche, or part 2 of the marriage of Psyche poem, that gives Ring of Bright Water its title. And she describes Psyche as walking on these bloody, bruised, battered feet, only knowing that she set out without remembering why. So I think we can sense a shift, but it comes many, many decades later. And certainly the period that Remember the Rowan covers, so 1949 to 1969, I think at various points she felt that without this love, her inspiration had run dry.
Mm. And it was also if Maxwell was an inspiration for her, it was a two-way process in some regards, wasn't it? Because she was instrumental at the beginning, whenever she first met him, in introducing him to publishers and so on in London. And I mean, you'll know more about this than I, Kirsten, but arguably, that led to all his later massive successes, really. Is that the case? I mean, and his success was massive.
It
So
was.
it
I
must
mean,
have
Ring of Bright Water. Yeah, it was the bestseller of 1960. It was outsold, I believe, only by the Bible and Churchill's memoirs.
Yes.
And then you'll see there's a headline that was too good to miss out in the novel, when it usurps Lady Chatterley's lover, that otters get on top of Lady Chatterley's lover, I think was the headline, which was actually too good, or rather too bad not to include. But yeah, he does enjoy tremendous success, and you're completely right. I think this is also, one of the things that infuriates me is this narrative that we so often encounter with the woman beside or behind great men. It's, oh, she was a writer too. But in fact, when they meet in 1949, he's a struggling portrait painter. He's not a writer at all. And one of, if not the first person to publish his work is Janet Adams Smith, the literary editor or editress. Gavin always liked to add a little feminization to these terms of the New Statesman. But what is particularly unsung is the fact that Janet Adams Smith was also godmother to Kathleen's daughter Anna. So she was one of her closest friends. You can really trace these connections, and I hope that comes across in the novel, that it would be too simplistic to say that he owed his success to Kathleen Raine, but you can see the depth of which she sought to nurture his career. So it feels cruelly ironic that then Scotland remembers him and not her. And indeed, one of their worst quarrels, it ends with the line, "My writing will be remembered when yours is forgotten." So I guess history will tell us who's correct.
Who is saying that to whom?
She says it to him at the end of a very, very particularly vicious quarrel. And then she relates this in the lion's mouth afterwards and says, "I don't think this is going to be the case." And of course, she regretted saying it, as I think in the heat of the moment we can all empathise with. But perhaps the jury's still out.
And the quarrels are indeed, they are extremely visceral and very striking, and at times harrowing to read, really. But towards the end of the novel, there's what appears to be a degree of reconciliation, I think. Is there, or am I mistaken in thinking that? Whenever Kathleen goes up to visit Gavin on was it a little island that he bought? He was going to try.
Yes, yes, yes.
So there seems to be some kind of reconciliation, or some kind of rapprochement between them.
I mean, that was an interesting thing to tackle in the novel. And of course, my priority has been to reach the emotional truth of their dynamics. So I've conflated a visit and a phone call there. So it played out ever so slightly differently in real life. And I think that scene perhaps epitomises that can't live with them, can't live without them energy that they have. They do quarrel even then, even when he is really in the final stages of his life, because at that point, Ring of Bright Water, the film has come out. There's a theme song. Her words are plastered all over the country, all over the world, soon to be, and she's unacknowledged. And yet, when she raises this with Gavin Maxwell, he tells her where to go for financial recompense, to speak to his business manager, and it just epitomizes the differing perspectives that they have, because of course she's saying nothing of the sort. She wants the emotional, the psychological, the spiritual recognition. She's not interested in the mercenary side of it. And a mirroring scene that happens much earlier on with that is that actually the launch of Gavin Maxwell's first book, Harpoon at a Venture, because he discovers a beautiful Victorian volume of seaweed samples. Some very diligent coastal walker has kept these samples of seaweed and annotated this book. And they're both gazing at this in wonder, and then Gavin starts ripping the seaweed out so that he can decorate the bookshop window, because Harpoon at a Venture is a nautical themed book. And it's a subtle scene. I suspect maybe readers might be, if they're racing through to the fights, it's not one that maybe echoes in their consciousness quite as intensely, but it really just shows the differing perspectives that they had. And again, in the scene that you're referring to, Gerry, when at the end of his life, he has, although this is up in the wilds of the West Highlands, Gavin Maxwell being Gavin Maxwell, it's a pretty luxurious setup he's created. And he has managed to acquire at auction a desk reputed to have belonged to William Wordsworth. And Kathleen says to him, "I don't know how you dare sit at that." And he says, "I don't know how you could resist." And I think that epitomises their differing perspectives on writing, on honouring, and on love and their relationship itself.
Yes, yes. Would you have a wee extract you might read?
Yes, absolutely. So I think, well, I might read one early on. From this context, as Gerry's mentioned, Gavin's sexuality is really the first cloud in their horizon at Sandake. So I can read you a bit of a scene where this is probably at the point when Kathleen is just feeling as if things are almost too good to be true, and as that transpires, it very much is. So let me just acquaint you with, we're in Gavin Maxwell's flat. This is 1949, and the first of one of many conversations in which they are candid, and yet the dynamic twists in a way that Kathleen is not expecting. "There's a certain way I can't love you," Gavin says. "Do you understand? Tread softly, because you tread on my dreams. I read more poetry for pleasure these days, as well as writing more myself." "I understand," I say, although of course I don't. All I know is that he is in pain, distress cutting across the elegant planes of his face like it did when I first opened my door to him, what feels like another lifetime ago. A strange, pleading sort of vulnerability has taken over Gavin's expression, some hidden hurt only a hair trigger away from defensiveness. His eyes are fixed on me. Troubled seas, seeking safe harbour. I find myself feeling, one can't help these things, you know? Abruptly, he turns his back. Gavin taps his whiskey glass against the window, as if the words he can't say are to be coaxed in from the cold. "I know," I tell him, although I don't, not yet. "It's not a choice, not at all, and I've done everything I can to... We can't control what we feel, can we?" "No." I can answer honestly this time. Gavin returns to sit on the other side of the sofa and starts hurriedly searching his pockets. My thoughts turn rather ludicrously to Roland's fumbled proposal in my parents' living room. He could not yet afford a ring, he said, but would I accept the romantic poets? Gavin produces a silver cigarette case. He offers me one. I decline. Technically, I believe it is considered ungentlemanly to light up regardless, but Gavin's anxiety seems such that he no longer has any choice. It's in my nature to be more of a man's man. The repetition strikes my ear. The poet in me hears him more clearly than the woman. A man's man, sexually. Tread softly because you tread on my dreams. I'm surprised. Shocked at my surprise. I thought we were too closely linked for him to surprise me. I take a drink. I understand, I say. And I try to. I've known or at least heard of this in men before. I'm not so very naive. What sort of poet would I be otherwise? My extended circle is rumoured to encompass a spectrum of unspoken preferences. It has never concerned me before. It has never been Gavin before. Can I have a cigarette after all? When he opens the case for me, I grip the paper hard, clenching the cigarette I take between my fingertips to prevent Gavin from seeing that my hands have started to shake. On instinct, he leans in to light it for me. This is as close as we will get tonight, I think, hit by a wave of nausea and nicotine. From the floor, Johnny seems to sense that something is amiss with that acuity of animal intuition no human could ever hope to match. Even through his haze of sleep, the tension between us is transmitted through the air to him. The dog curls his body tight inside his basket and his ears begin to twitch. Kathleen. Gavin is staring at me with all the desperation of a drowning man. I want to help him. He needs me to help him. Isn't that why I'm here? Some cosmic, uncalled for connection that is so much more powerful than either of us alone? I force myself to focus not on where he treads, not on what of me has fallen beneath his feet, but on what he has chosen to place in my hands. His faith, his trust, quite literally, his freedom. The wrong words spoken to the wrong person would mean prison for him. Prison and utter, irredeemable disgrace. The dukedom is not so very distant from this flat, after all. Someone like him, from such a family as his, and with his war record, newspapers are sold on the sordid tales of those prosecutions. Men humiliated on the stand and shamed in the streets for things they have done or even just felt in private. Imprisonment is the usual sentence. Chemical castration the alternative. I take another, longer drink. The shaking does not stop. Gavin may not want me the way I want him to. Not the way I want him. But he trusts me enough to let me hold his freedom in my hands. And isn't trust the most important part of love? I've fought it. The hoarse anguish in his voice affirms he is telling me the truth. The hollows of his cheeks no amount of physical nourishment can fill. The indigo shadows I've noticed settling under his eyes at the end of each day when he grows tired. Outward scars of an internal war. A constant battle waged against what one feels. I look at Gavin's face in the lowering autumn light. God knows, I could not win it either. Now, speaking of light, I can see I'm getting quite shady there, so I'm going to pop this light on myself. But I think that's the turning point at which Kathleen realises that the only way to have him in her life is through a platonic love. Now, we toss about the term platonic quite readily these days as some sort of watered down version of romance. But in fact, for her, I think, especially given her William Blake research, her understanding of Neoplatonic thought and the Neoplatonic threads that are woven into Blake's own of her, that this could be something more, this could be something precious, a truly Platonic connection. And yet the difficulties of that are what gives much of the rest of the novel its shape.
Yes, and your research to write the novel was, I believe, very extensive. I mean, which included visiting Kathleen's birthplace. Was it Great Barrington she was born?
Yes, no, she was technically born in Ilford.
In Ilford,
which she could not stand in the way she describes Ilford. And please do not take offence, anybody that watches this later from Ilford. I think she felt the kind of, the brick walls of kind of middle-class life of suburbia were very, very constraining to her. And it's during the First World War. So she's born 1908, 1914. She is evacuated as a very cherished only daughter, only child. She is sent to live with her Aunt Peggy in Great Barrington. And this is really the kernel of her poetic vision. So it was a very, very precious place to her, and actually where her ashes were later scattered after her death.
And your research also included, I believe, going to the National Library of Scotland and going through manuscripts and all sorts of things. Well, Gavin Maxwell manuscripts, I believe.
Absolutely. That was such a treat. And I have my National Library card. I began the novel late 2020, so it was during all the lockdowns. So it was a while before I could get into the reading rooms, into special collections. And it's supposed to be a little passport photo on the reader card. And in fact, I am beaming ear to ear because I'm so delighted to be there. And really what I find with the research like that, when you're reading journals, when you're reading letters, is that you get a sense of the everyday turns of phrases, the everyday interests and irritations in a way that just never comes across quite the same way in published work. A tiny example is the fact that Gavin actually refers to his beloved spaniel Johnny as John Dog in his letters. So of course you can include that colloquialism. And really, above all, when I was delving into the Gavin Maxwell papers, his charm shines off the page. And you're talking, would it be 70 years later for some of these records? And yet you could shed a tear, you could laugh out loud. One of my all-time favourite finds, one of the first records I actually looked at was Gavin Maxwell's fan mail. And I thought, oh, this will be what fans have written to him. But it was so much better, because it was in fact his responses to his secretary telling her what to say, or secretaries, because they didn't seem to last long. And so you have these tiny little red scrawled notes. My all-time favourite, I think, was a little boy had written to say, I'm doing a school project on otters, and could you give me some more information? And Gavin Maxwell has written back, tell this wicked and presumptuous child to show some initiative and go to his local public library. I'm not writing his thesis for him. And then we have the secretary. This is really rather a vague question, and have you considered going to the library? So from that alone, I think it was very easy to empathise with Kathleen, having fallen head over heels for this this charmer even through the ages.
Yes, he obviously had something. He had some particular charisma that she should be so fixated on him for such a period. There was also that which you also detail in the novel, where was it after the death of one of the otters? He had this sort of obsession with exotic creatures that he brought into his flat in London. And could you talk just a wee bit about that?
Yes, absolutely. And Team Ringwood, they had to be quite strict with me. That chapter was a lot longer in first draft form, because I think I was just having too much fun at Harrod's Exotic Pet Hall, which is where he acquired these creatures. So yeah, tell me you're in the 60s without telling me you're in the 60s. I think the Harrod's Exotic Pet Hall might as well do it. But yes, he has a lemur, which I think actually, otters aside, is probably the creature that comes to pose the greatest threat to him, because he interprets Kiko the lemur as psychotic. It might be. Could it be that she's been kept in a flat in Chelsea? Who knows? Who can say? But Kiko, off she goes to the zoo. Still owned by Gavin, of course, but hopefully she found greater enrichment, as we say, SSPCA volunteers in a zoo environment at least. And he then acquires a bush baby, which you know your natural history much better than me, Gerry, but I didn't know anything at all about bush babies, and when I researched them, they are very cute. Again, probably not an ideal house pet, but the bush baby is given short shift because their hobbies are, and I quote Gavin Maxwell here, solitary and embarrassing. So that was it. The bush baby is also rehomed, and then he decides to have a baker's dozen of tropical birds. He wallpapers the ceiling black, sets up little perches with fruit, and they flit from bookcase to bookcase. But actually, there's kind of, amongst the comedy, there's tragedy and there's pathos, to see what was once the kind of magic of the natural world reduced to this, and trying to desperately to recapture something that up at Sandaig with their beloved otters in the heart of true nature needed no effort at all.
Yeah, and Kathleen was remarkably willing to take on the great responsibility of looking after the otter that he brought back from, was it Iraq?
Yes. So midge was actually a then undiscovered species or subspecies. So literally Maxwell's otter, Lutrigale perspiculatae maxwelli. I'm probably butchering the Latin there, but yeah, it becomes actually Maxwell's otter as a result.
Yeah, I remember thinking that was a very considerable responsibility that she took on, because it was sort of, you know, you could almost see it being overshadowed by the idea that at some point this otter is going to go missing and it's going to be heartbreaking, and because she's the one who's responsible and supposed to be caring for it, she will be responsible.
Yeah, yeah.
So it
yeah,
was.
it's interesting because Kathleen often refers to, and yeah, spoiler alert, I hope if anybody hasn't quite got to the 1960s classic Ring of Bright Water, yeah, that it's probably fairly obvious that the story's not going to end well for an otter that's popped in a sack as a cub and flown over to London. But it's interesting that in her own autobiographical writing, Kathleen often referred to Midge the otter as their water baby. And I think he was, in many ways, knowing from the sexuality dynamics that I've discussed, that they were never going to have a biological child, that through Midge, she could love Gavin, she could give as much as he would be willing to receive. They met at last in the heart of an otter is one of the most resonant and powerful phrases that with which Gavin inscribes Kathleen's copy of Harpoon at a Venture. And I'm struck, actually, when you're asking that question, I think about Kathleen's experiences with human motherhood as well, because it is very interesting. She not only takes the lion's share of caring for Midge, unsung, because we all know, we grew up in Scotland knowing that Gavin Maxwell had pet otters, but whoever hears that Kathleen Raine in fact had a pet otter as well, and she'll describe Midge sharing her bath in the morning, the little white scars in her hands that would never leave her from his teeth, and yet she gets all of the responsibility and none of the recognition. And then, as you say, she is bearing that responsibility when tragedy ensues, and that mirrors in quite an interesting way her experiences with her children. It's gone into kind of notoriety that Kathleen lived apart from her children at one point, that when she, after the war, when she goes to London to kind of seek her fortune as a poet, she entrusts them to the care of Helen Sutherland, her patron, who lived at Cockley Moor, the house I was lucky enough to visit. And I think it's, even from a pragmatic point of view, it's easy to see why you would think it's a better environment for children in the beautiful Lake District than blitz-blasted London, and yet she has carried the shame of that ever since. Her reputation suffered as a result, and yet I've never, in reading everything that I can possibly lay my hands on, I've never held Charles Madge accused of abandoning these children, of failing to support these children. So it's yes, it's quite telling in terms of how women's responsibility rather than power tends to be what women are granted, and that is the case even in the relationship, the triangular relationship between Gavin, Kathleen, and Midge the otter.
She went on, didn't she, after Maxwell died? What year did Maxwell die in?
He died 1969.
And she lived, what, another 36 years, really, didn't she, beyond
so
him?
yeah, almost 34. It was 2003 that she died.
Was it 2003?
And she was 95.
Right. Yes.
And it's a very tragic death as well, that she was knocked down by a car while posting a letter. It's because I see, whenever I say 95, I see people's shoulders kind of soften. It's like that kind of awful good innings idea. And in fact, she said to her daughter Anna that she'd done almost everything she wanted to in life, which is a very, very Kathleen Raine phrase. And somebody at another book event made the point to me, and I will say it's not often that something to do with the Kathleen Raine universe hasn't occurred to me, but they said, my goodness, words were what killed her. She was posting a letter that threw to her last moments. So yes, she lived till 2003, and so it's a good, I think, almost 34 years without Gavin Maxwell. So actually longer without him than she had with him.
And she wrote wonderful letters, as I recall.
Yeah, she would do, and that's one of my, yes, I remember that was even before we first met, and when we first met online, these beautiful and I know that Gerry will not be will be too modest to say, so I can say that when she read Gerry's early poems, that she observed that poems through which the blow the wind of, now, oh gosh, I'm butchering it now, and I usually have it off by heart, the winds of joy and beauty. Oh gosh, I'm getting this completely. You're going to have to. This is a sign, Gerry, that you have to tell it yourself. The
winds of joy and beauty in language, or something.
Or is it
something like
Beauty and Life? Everyone, I will post this because I do have it saved, because I remember finding this very, very inspiring and very, very interesting. And you can see even into her later years how much she wanted to, support Scottish poets in whom she saw the imagination.
It's important to encourage, really, and she had a terrific life energy in these responses. I remember, and I also remember her being very. This may have been an aspect of her age, her advanced age at that point, but also an aspect, I think, of her independence of mind and force of personality. She could be wonderfully iconoclastic about male editors and so on. I remember being a wee bit like that about the editor of Agenda, William Cookson. Respectful, but also saying, well, he's a man, he's going to think that. I remember Philip Hobsbawm, whenever Kathleen Raine came up briefly in discussion, more or less dismissing her Blake scholarship and saying, well, she's not a Blake scholar. She's not a Blake scholar. Which is kind of extraordinary, considering that she was invited to America to actually lecture on that. What was that, the A.W. Mellon
Yes, the A.W. Mellon lecture. So I know that would have, but she's not really a Blake scholar, would have been certainly news to the National Academy of Fine Arts. And she was the first woman in history to deliver the A.W. Mellon lectures there, all about her. And it became this incredible 2-volume epic, Blake and Tradition. And there's an abridged version, Blake and Antiquity, which is also well worth a read. So really paradigm shifting scholarship. And I've looked up that quote before. Poems through which blows the wind of joy and beauty and language. So if I'm going to embarrass you, I want to get it right, Gerry.
Aye. Oh well. Yes, but it was wonderful to have a correspondence with her. I'm only sorry that I never interviewed her for the Dark Horse, because the one time that I did meet her in London at her house, I was passing through after having interviewed Wendy Cope. And I was sufficiently intimidated by Kathleen not to tell her why I was down south, because I thought she would say, oh, Wendy Cope, just terrible, unimportant poet. You know?
I think your intuition probably serves you right there. I think that's exactly what she would have said.
Although Wendy Cope was extremely feminist in her own way as well.
Well, that's perhaps why, because Kathleen quite famously, I'm certainly no feminist, and she does have, I think, perhaps the materiality of second wave feminism did not appeal to her, because her vision is always about the transcendent, always about something greater. And needless to say, that's not what I think, but it's an intriguing critique. And she also, even in India Seen Afar, her 4th volume of autobiography, she describes that women should not be aspiring to be honorary men. And actually that's something that modern day feminism is only now kind of reconciling with. It. It's not just a question of trying to get a seat at the table, but wondering why the table is the shape as it is. Do we indeed need to be at a table at all? Does power need to, is it a question of us aping masculinity to get where we want to be as individuals, or is there a better way to live collectively? So she accidentally or deliberately, she stumbled upon some very, very interesting critiques of feminism. And I know that she does appear in the Dark Horse, though, the Peter Russell, reviewing Peter Russell. And I think even that contribution, you can get a very strong sense of her later years and a certain waspishness. My favourite line, I think, is that she says Russell takes up a language as he would take up a foreign mistress.
Yes, and it was beautifully written, that piece as well.
Yes.
But the poems of Quintilius. So anyway, time is kind of moving on. It's about 4:05. Should we open up just briefly if there's any questions?
Yeah, of course. So please, everybody, do feel free to pop them in the chat, and we'll keep an eye on them. And yes, so we're going to be exploring this in greater detail, aren't we, in a future horse issue as well, Kathleen's connection with Scotland, which I'm very, very exciting to. And it's the right time to write that, because one of her key visits up here in her later years was for the opening of the Scottish Poetry Library, braving a blizzard, so the weather sagas continue. That's just Scottish poetry, I suppose. But they have obviously just celebrated their 40th anniversary, or are indeed celebrating it this very month. So it's fascinating to think back. So yeah, please do. Yeah, absolutely. So I see Geraldine's popped in the chat. Can we ask questions on camera? Yeah, absolutely. Just be aware the recording is still going, but if you don't mind that, yeah, we'd absolutely love to hear your voice and join the conversation.
Actually, it's not a question, but just to say that was absolutely fantastic. Such interesting and engaging replies, and so funny, and very erudite, and lovely to hear you read from the actual book as well. That's the dialogue and the passion and the interweaving, and really looking forward to reading my own copy. Just could almost reach out and touch it on the coffee table.
That's so kind of you, Geraldine. Thank you. And actually,
really fantastic. Yeah, so glad. What a treat for a Saturday afternoon. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much for being here. That's really lovely to hear. And actually, I will hold it because Geraldine mentioned she knows that you've got a copy coming your way. This is fantastic. That very copy. I don't know if you can see your name.
I can't actually see it on the camera, but it's seeing is believing. Thank you.
So yes, so that's where our readings have come from. So yeah, please do let me know what you think.
Thank you. I will. Yeah, really looking forward to it. Thanks. Okay, I'll go off audio now. If I think of another question, I'll type it.
Of course, thank you so much for coming along this afternoon. And that was the beauty of our kind of plan B, is that our friends from all over the country could join. And I can see Emily's asked a question in the chat as well, if I had any reaction to the book from Gavin Maxwell fans. That's a great question, and not gonna lie, I was anticipating a little bit from some of the Altar Boys. Now, within reason, because really, can anybody be a fan of Gavin Maxwell? You must know he's a complicated individual. I don't quite know what you would be admiring him if not that. Overall, I have been blown away by the warmth and the support with which the book has been embraced. Readers will find that the Gavin Maxwell estate very generously gave me permission to include Gavin's real letter to Kathleen at a key moment. I don't want to spoil why he's writing to her on that occasion, but it is really the text that he sent her. As one of my friends said, I think they realised it would be worse if you made it up, which may be true, but either way, so appreciated that generosity. The only comment that kind of has gone down in notoriety in my head was when news of the book broke and it was online. I think, as I say, 99% of the comments were wonderful, and there was one that said crazy witch. Now, I don't know whether that was Kathleen's the crazy witch, whether it's me, whether it's a bit of both, but that is why I say that the real goal is one fewer person to think of her as a witch, think of her as a woman, or better still, think of her as a poet, because she can be both.
That is it's almost like the exception to the rule. Like, you need that one to give balance to everything else. I just want to echo what Geraldine said. That was such a gorgeous conversation. Thank you. And thanks for your time.
Thank you for having us. And yes, I'll pop the link in the chat to the book. But I think probably everybody here has already got their copy. And thank you for pivoting online, everybody. And we will look forward to welcoming you back to the Nature Library in person very soon.
So I've just seen a question squeeze in from Rosie here. Looking forward to reading this work, as they were a complex couple, and she was written out by his ego. Would you consider him a narcissistic personality?
Oh, that makes me, that's a good question, Rosie. And we did joke at Ringwood, when you talk about content warnings and the like on books, kind of caution, this text contains a narcissist some women may find attractive. I think now we've not to posthumously diagnose anybody with anything. We know that rule. And it's funny because the authorised biography of Gavin Maxwell that was written by Douglas Botting, published first in 1990, I believe. It's funny because whenever I read a literary biography in the 90s, they're very often diagnosed as bipolar. And it seems to be that this was the language through which people express that volatility. Now, I think terms like narcissism we're a lot more familiar with, and who can say, as I say, I'm not a clinician, I'm not a psychologist, so I couldn't formally diagnose him with anything, but I think there are definitely narcissistic behaviours, definitely narcissistic traits. As Kathleen herself put, Gavin never did anything other than because he wanted to. Now, maybe that's true of us all to greater or lesser degree, but I think really what perhaps caused her almost the most pain out of it all was the kind of out of sight, out of mind energy. She could never be sure what Gavin Maxwell felt for her. And actually, I've kind of leaned into that tension within the book, that Kathleen died not knowing, perhaps he died not knowing. So it's right that we have to inhabit that tension with her. So was he just using her for her connections in a very kind of material, concrete way? Did he love her as much as he was able to? We'll never know for sure. As a writer, I always say show, don't tell, so actions speak louder than words. So I think readers will decide that for themselves as they kind of see how the relationship plays out with his behaviour towards her at various points. But I think it's one term that I have heard, and I think it's a very valid one, Rosie. So thank you for that question.
Yeah, thank you. I just have one quick one, and then yeah, we can
go for it. Yeah, this is a treat because I can see that we're all kind of sinking into darkness, but because we're in our own living rooms, that's
just cozy up for the night. But I was curious because there was something you said near the start about the fact that you hadn't come across her work, and why is that? And it was just that kind of frustration that she wasn't being taught. Because as when I studied photography, it was only after I studied that I learned about Anna Atkins, who was considered to be the first female photographer. And I just never, how did I study photography for however many years, and these kind of pioneering photographers didn't come up. So I was just curious, do you think, or have you noticed, do you know anything about, is she being taught more now? Like, is her, and I know like in the poetry kind of world, for she is kind of, Gerry, you were saying she is quite well known, but out with that, do you feel like it is getting there? Or is...
I think so. I think this is definitely part of yes, part of a wave, and I hope it's a tidal wave. I mentioned about English heritage and the blue plaque and the frustration of that her current profile isn't high enough. But I know that friends and scholars that I've encountered as part of the novel research, they are passionate about sharing her. So I know that she is increasingly appearing in workshops. We had a wonderful happy birthday Kathleen Raine. We've had events at the Scottish Poetry Library. We also had one at the Nature Library. So I think the openness to that in itself is testament to a bit of a shift. It feels like, I think until we have actually Rain Day every 14th of June, it'll never be enough for me. And I know that it is part of a wider movement, which is very, very welcome. As you've pointed to, Christina, in your own work, in your own practice. For instance, I know that there's a biography coming on Helen Sutherland, now an absolute key patron at this time, but a name that so few of us know. Again, and linked to Kathleen plays a really important role in her life. So it's just wonderful to see. I think people have almost makes me want to put my librarian hat on, because we're often told, or historically we're told, that collections should be neutral. But of course we realise that one person's version of neutral is it's just that, it's one person's, and actually we lose such richness if stories, if perspectives, or if there's room on the shelf for everybody, and there's no debate that I think isn't enriched with more voices, more perspectives, more to read rather than less. So I think that wider kind of, whether you call it theoretical grounding or just a perspective shift, I think that's really welcome. My next book, now this is very, 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 very early stages, but the theme that I want to tackle, because I always said that there could never be a woman to follow Kathleen, and that's true, but I might have just found two, because I'm writing now about Margaret and Frances MacDonald, the wife and sister-in-law of Charles Rennie Mackintosh, but avant-garde icons in their own right. But actually, Mackintosh was not hostile. He famously said that Margaret has genius, I have only talent. So this is actually about how we as a culture tell our stories, because there has been this, especially coming from Glasgow, that kind of isolated genius model that Mackintosh just appeared, emerges in the Cabbage Patch one day, just gifted as they come. And in fact, we lose a really deep understanding if we fail to acknowledge these connections, these relationships, creatively, personally, you name it. So I think there's definitely space for Kathleen Raine, because as Gerry's pointed out, with the Dark Horse, with her support for poets who up and coming in her later years, she understood that. She understood that it's an ecosystem and that a rising tide lifts all boats. So I think it's really welcome to see that happening across the discipline and across scholarship now.
Thank you. Well, we should probably wrap that up now.
We
But
should. I mean, it wouldn't be the first time I'd made myself hoarse talking about Kathleen Raine. So yes, I shall.
It won't be the last. Well, yeah, thank you everyone for joining us. We have been recording this, so it'll be able to be watched back and shared. And yeah, thank you, Gerry, for brilliant questions and just opening up that conversation.
No worries. Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Thank you. Well, yeah, and everyone stay safe if the storm is bad where you are. And stay cozy.
Yep. It's a good weather to stay in with a good book. So,
yes, and we can obviously recommend one.
Oh, thank you for having me. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Bye.
Bye-bye.